White opens the game by establishing hypermodern central control right away, immediately placing a pawn in the absolute center to influence key squares. This initial action lays the groundwork for subsequent development and creates potential for a strong pawn chain if reinforced. The move, the knight to f6 by black, is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to e5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to c6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to b5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows short castles, guaranteeing long-term space control. White accepts the challenge, gaining vital space while kicking the developing minor piece. This dynamic advantage in the center forces black into an awkward retreat or repositioning, typical of structures aiming to establish a cramping pawn chain. The minor piece centralizes actively, occupying a temporary strong outpost deep in White's half. However, this piece remains somewhat exposed and vulnerable to further pawn advances, requiring careful prophylactic thinking to secure its stability long term. Reinforcing the initial central push, White solidifies their positional restriction over Black's setup. This overprotection of the central wedge provides a firm foundation for future development, ensuring a lasting spatial advantage. Attacking the base of the chain immediately, Black attempts to undermine the cramping central structure. This crucial break aims to challenge White's spatial superiority and prevent the consolidation of a dangerous center. Developing a knight to defend the center is natural, but it slightly misplaces priorities, allowing Black to equalize the tension. This slight inaccuracy misses more demanding prophylactic measures that could have maintained a tighter grip. Preparing a fianchetto for the king's bishop introduces long-term pressure on the central diagonals, but it slightly neglects immediate tension resolution. This structural commitment allows White time to coordinate. Deploying the light-squared bishop aggressively targets a potential weak square and develops rapidly. White aims to control vital central diagonals while preparing for castling and enhancing dynamic activity. Relocating the centralized minor piece forces a decision from White's bishop while improving coordination. This maneuver simplifies the center dynamically, asking questions of White's long-term plan for their active minor piece. Retreating safely, the bishop maintains its gaze across the diagonal. This prophylactic repositioning keeps the tension alive without committing to unfavorable exchanges, preserving dynamic options. Completing the fianchetto, Black enhances hypermodern central control with the king's bishop. The dark squared diagonal is now fully contested, setting up a solid long-term plan based on indirect pressure. The move, the knight on the b5 to d2 by White, is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to a4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the d-file takes on e5, executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to a5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight on rank 6 to d7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on f7 with check, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the king, takes on f7, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Securing the king's safety is standard, yet it slightly misjudges the immediate requirements of the central battle. This solid prophylactic thinking drops a fraction of an edge, allowing White to regroup, creating a small escape square and limiting enemy minor piece incursions. Demonstrates prophylaxis, but it is somewhat slow. This slight inaccuracy allows black to equalize the game completely. Gaining space on the queenside restricts white's expansion capabilities and prepares to activate the rook. This flank majority play introduces a long-term plan of grinding down the opponent's spatial advantages. Halting the enemy pawn advance immediately fixes the flank structure at I-turn. And I-turn, and then down. This blockade ensures black cannot gain further ground easily, securing structural integrity on the queen side. Releasing central tension clarifies the pawn structure. Black opts for structural simplification to remove white's cramping spatial edge, transitioning into a more balanced middle game. Recapturing centrally keeps the position symmetrical and balanced. White maintains a solid pawn structure, while fully equalizing the positional landscape, preparing to finalize development. Activating the minor piece to the edge of the board initially seems passive, but it prepares rapid redeployment to more vital central squares. This maneuver exemplifies improving the worst piece systematically. Castling finishes the basic, opening requirements, safeguarding the king. White completes their development harmoniously, keeping the dynamic equilibrium perfectly maintained in this quiet positional struggle. Repositioning the edge knight to a dominant central outpost maximizes its activity. This powerful minor piece placement puts pressure on white's structure and restricts enemy mobility effectively. Connecting the heavy pieces while centralizing the queen improves white's coordination slightly. This cautious maneuver aims for overprotection of key squares and prepares for potential flank actions. Relocating the queen defensively reveals a slight misunderstanding of the immediate dynamic requirements. And this subtle inaccuracy disrupts coordination and drops a fraction of equality, giving white a brief window. The move, the knight to e4 by white, is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to d4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Paving the way for the queen to d7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight on rank 2 to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the knight takes on b3, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the knight takes on b, Yagdigus executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on a4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Capturing the advanced flank pawn creates immediate material imbalance briefly, while resolving tension. Black executes a sharp tactical sequence, confirming their slight advantage from white's prior error. Trading light-squared bishops simplifies the position. This defensive simplification removes a key attacking piece from black, although white remains structurally pressured. Recapturing maintains the dynamic edge for black. The simplification favors the side with better central control, as black's remaining minor pieces coordinate exceptionally well in the ensuing middle game. Activating the rook to the central file challenges black's coordination. This overprotection of crucial central files is an attempt to generate counterplay and stabilize a difficult structure. Retreating the active knight regroups black's forces. This prophylactic measure ensures the piece is not trapped, while preparing to challenge white's control of the center anew. Developing the remaining dark-squared bishop connects the rooks fully. However, white is struggling to find active plans against black's solid positional restriction. Pushing the flank pawn creates a severe cramping effect on white's queenside. This advanced unit acts as a powerful positional wedge, securing a lasting static advantage for black. Pinning. The knight looks active but is actually a slight inaccuracy. Once into your slot area, it allows black to solidify their structure and gain further space on the king side with tempo-gaining moves. Questioning the pinning bishop forces a decision immediately. This aggressive prophylactic thinking gains crucial space on the king side and dictates the flow of the resulting maneuvers. Retreating the bishop keeps the pin, but drops further coordination. This inaccuracy allows black to complete their optimal deployment, solidifying a noticeable positional superiority. Activating the queen's bishop completes black's harmonic development. All pieces are now perfectly placed, creating an overwhelming static advantage based on central control and superior coordination. The move, the pawn to G4, by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to D4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the bishop takes on E4, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on E4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the pawn to A3 secures, an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the rook takes on A3, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on A3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Relocating the bishop defensively drops a fraction of the massive advantage, while solid and more forcing continuation was missed, allowing white a momentary breath in a dire situation. Centralizing the knight attempts to generate counterplay, but evaluates as an inaccuracy. It permits black to clarify the position favorably through tactical exchanges. Pinning the central knight with the queen's bishop applies immense pressure. Black accurately improves their worst piece, creating unbreakable tactical and structural threat. Unpinning the knight while centralizing the queen slightly misplaces defensive resources. This inaccuracy confirms black's complete dominance, equivalent to being a clean pawn up positionally. The move, the queen, to D7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on E5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the queen takes on H6, executes a favorable trade, which enables the bishop to G7 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to D2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to F6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to B3, guaranteeing long-term space control. Bringing the rook to the center is a solid, accurate, stabilizing move. White successfully navigates black's previous mistake, regaining a foothold and significantly reducing the positional deficit. The move, the rook on the F-file to E8, by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to A3, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the B-file takes on A3, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook, takes on A3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the queen to B4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the rook takes on H3, executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight to F5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move, the pawn to F4 by white, is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to B3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to C5, significantly boosting piece coordination. And continuing with the knight, takes on C5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the queen to C7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. unlocking the queen to B4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the E file to C8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Centralizing the dark squared bishop strongly attacks white's exposed structure. Black correctly identifies the weakness created by white's blunder, initiating severe positional restriction. Leaping into a somewhat active square, white tries to muddy the waters. However, black's structural integrity remains unbreached, and the dark squared blockade holds firm. Retreating the queen defensively maintains the pressure safely. This solid repositioning prepares to slowly exploit white's ruined kingside structure while avoiding tactical pitfalls. Relocating the queen misplaces her slightly, allowing black to consolidate. This inaccuracy from white exacerbates their defensive woes, solidifying black's overwhelming positional advantage. The move, the pawn to e6 by black, is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to c6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to f2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to a3 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to e6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to e2, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the king to h2 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to b5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the knight to d7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d3 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to c5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to d2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to c6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Rerouting the knight slightly drops the advantage. While strategically sound to seek a better outpost, it lacks the immediate forcing nature required to capitalize fully on white's passivity. The move, the knight to d3 by white, is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the knight takes on d7, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the queen takes on d7 executes a favorable trade, which enables the queen to d3 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the queen takes on b5 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen, takes on b5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Challenging the center immediately with a pawn thrust is highly accurate. Black attacks the base of the chain, breaking white's remnants of central control and confirming their decisive edge. Activating the knight aggressively is the best practical try in a lost position. White attempts to create complications, but black's solid structure easily absorbs the pressure. Centralizing the queen is a slight inaccuracy that surprisingly dropped a fraction of the massive advantage. A more forcing continuation was available to completely suffocate white's counterplay. Planting the knight deeply is a slight inaccuracy. While visually appealing, this strong outpost piece is tactically vulnerable and allows black to simplify favorably. Liquidating the dangerous knight immediately is an accurate defensive simplification. Black removes white's only active piece, transitioning closer to a technically won endgame.
You
Recapturing yields white a passed pawn, but it is structurally weak and firmly blockaded. White's position remains strategically lost, despite the creation of this new asset. Exchanging a minor piece accurately simplifies the position further. Black systematically dismantles White's defenses, adhering strictly to the principle of liquidating into a totally winning structure. Taking back leaves White with doubled pawns and an incredibly passive position. The structural ruin is profound, leaving Black with a devastating positional superiority. Solidifying a kingside pawn structure with precise prophylactic thinking completely shuts down any potential tactical swindle. Black slowly tightens the noose around White's paralyzed setup. Pushing the kingside pawn is a slight inaccuracy in a desperate situation. White tries to create weaknesses, but it only exposes their own structure further to Black's active pieces. The move. The pawn on the H-file takes on G5 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to F3, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the rook to B1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to C4 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the king to G3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to C6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to B4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Attacking the pawn is solid and accurate, establishing a slightly better coordination for White than before. The massive disadvantage remains, but Black's execution is no longer flawless. Pushing the F-pawn to secure the center is slightly inaccurate, dropping a fraction of the advantage. While strong, it allows White's dark-squared bishop a modicum of scope on the diagonal. Retreating the bishop is a solid maneuver, preserving the piece while maintaining an eye on long diagonals. White correctly aims to survive the suffocating positional restriction. Some nuisance. The move, the king to F7 by Black, is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to A3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to C4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on C4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the knight to E5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the knight takes on E5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on E5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Jumping in with a knight check is a solid, active defensive measure. White utilizes their limited dynamic resources efficiently to complicate the position and harass the enemy king. Capturing the active knight simplifies the position further, which is structurally sound but evaluated as a slight inaccuracy. Black prefers a clear technical task over calculating complex tactical variations. Recapturing with the bishop maintains a solid presence for White. Despite being a pawn down conceptually in valuation, this piece placement maximizes their defensive tenacity. Lancing a flank pawn creates an active majority, aiming to create a passed pawn. This accurate strategic decision emphasizes Black's long-term plan of overwhelming White on the queen side. Activating the rook to a semi-open file is a slight inaccuracy, dropping a fraction of defense. White attempts to create counterplay, but it somewhat misplaces the piece defensively. Why? The move the rook to H8 by Black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook on the E file to D8, activating the rook on an open file. paving the way for the rook to f4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to e8 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to h4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to d7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to h6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Repositioning the bishop is a slight inaccuracy by white, missing a stronger continuation to fully equalize. Still, they have successfully navigated the worst and are back in a fighting position. Pushing the flank pawn further is a slight inaccuracy. While creating a pass pawn is conceptually correct, timing is vital, and this move drops a small amount of initiative. The move the rook to f4 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to a1, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to a2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook on the f-file to d1 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to c4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d7 with highly aggressive threat. This allows the rook on the h-file to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Pushing the passed pawn to the penultimate rank is highly accurate. Black creates an immediate, terrifying threat of promotion, completely dominating the endgame landscape. Pushing a pawn to challenge the center is white's best practical try. Facing immense promotion, they seek to create any sort of distraction or counter threat. Capturing the pawn accurately simplifies the position while maintaining the devastating passed pawn threat. Black efficiently removes white's meager counterplay resources. Pushing the passed pawn is a slight inaccuracy, dropping a fraction of defense. White desperately hopes to create their own distraction, but black's control is too absolute. The move, the bishop to d5, by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to e5, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the bishop takes on e5 executes a favorable trade, which enables the rook on the h-file to d8 to organize the counter-offensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to e6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. Improving the king defensively is an accurate reaction to black's mistake. White solidifies their position slightly, preparing to support their own threats in this chaotic endgame. Checking the king actively utilizes the rook. Black maintains clear superiority, forcing white's king to awkward squares while keeping the passed pawn firmly defended. Blocking the check with a pawn is solid and accurate. White successfully defends while maintaining the tension surrounding the race of the passed pawns, rerouting the other rook accurately to support the passed pawn or attack white's weaknesses. Black steadily reorganizes for the final breakthrough. Moving the rook laterally is an accurate defensive try, aiming to monitor the passed pawn and create eventual counterplay. White is holding on by a thread. Pushing the central pawn is a solid, accurate move that solidifies black's center and restricts white's bishop further. The crushing pressure is systematically maintained. Checking the king with the rook is accurate, forcing the monarch to a less desirable square. White efficiently uses their limited active resources to slightly disrupt black's coordination. Stepping the king to an active square is a solid and accurate response. Black centralized the king aggressively, preparing to support the final push while evading further check. Another rook check accurately keeps the pressure on the black king. White's only hope lies in perpetual harassment, trying to delay the inevitable execution of black's advantage. Retreating the king to safety while remaining centralized is solid. Black navigates the checks carefully, preserving their clear structural advantage and the dangerous passed pawn. The move, the rook takes on e5, by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to d8, promoting to queen with check, delivering a check that forces defensive coordination. Afterwards, the rook takes on d8, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook, takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the king to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d8, executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to a1 promoting to queen, guaranteeing long-term space control. Capturing with check is a slight inaccuracy, surprisingly dropping a bit of evaluation. While strong, a more clinical technical sequence might have immediately sealed white's fate. Moving the king out of check accurately maintains the best defense. White navigates the immediate tactical threat, though their strategic position remains entirely hopeless. A rook check continues the relentless assault. Black accurately targets white's king, preparing to win crucial material or force the promotion of their passed pawn. Fleeing with the king is the only solid response. White is entirely on the back foot, desperately hoping for a miracle in a technically lost endgame. Capturing the crucial passed pawn with the king eliminates white's final shred of counterplay. Black's solid execution secures an overwhelming, clear advantage heading into the simplified endgame. Recapturing with a check is an accurate but desperate measure. White regains some material equivalence, but black's overwhelming positional superiority and dangerous passed pawns dictate the outcome. Stepping out of check while staying extremely active. Black's king aggressively supports the advancing pawns, cementing a massive winning advantage. Another rook check is solid defense by white, continually harassing the black king in a futile effort to delay the inevitable promotion. Retreating the king logically navigates the checks while remaining close enough to support the action. Black's solid endgame technique slowly suffocates white. Checking again maintains the only defensive plan white has left. Accurate execution of these delaying tactics is their only saving grace in a lost cause. The move the king to a 6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the king to b6, claiming key space in the center, allowing the bishop to d8 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. Continuing with the rook takes on d8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on d8, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the rook to h2 with highly aggressive threats. Next comes the rook on rank 1 to d6, with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. Aligning rooks on the d-file is a solid, accurate move by white. They prepare a final defensive stand by challenging the control of vital squares, capitalizing slightly on black's recent inaccuracy. The move the rook takes on d2 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to e8 with check, delivering a check that forces defensive coordination. Paving the way for the king to f2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the rook takes on d2 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. I want seems. I train. Stay on the same. This leads to the rook takes on d2, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to b4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the rook takes on a2 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Recapturing with the king accurately centralizes the white monarch. Thanks to black's error, white has incredibly salvaged the position, reducing a massive deficit to a barely tangible disadvantage. Pushing the queenside pawn solidly maintains the flank majority. Black is trying to grind out a tiny edge in this pawn ending, but white's king is perfectly placed to defend. Pushing a kingside pawn accurately gains space and creates potential counter-threats. White plays optimally, establishing a solid blockade and preventing black from making easy progress. Improving the king's position accurately prepares to support the pawn advance. Black continues to probe for a breakthrough in an ending that is now incredibly balanced and drawn. Pushing another pawn accurately locks the kingside structure. White solidifies their positional restriction, ensuring black cannot easily create a second passed pawn on that side. Advancing the central pawn is a solid attempt to create a breakthrough. Black utilizes their remaining structural advantages, forcing white to maintain absolute precision to hold the draw. Activating the rook to the edge file is accurate defense. White prepares to challenge black's dangerous passed pawn laterally, demonstrating excellent endgame prophylactic thinking guide. Exchanging pawns accurately clarifies the kingside structure. Black simplifies the pawn formation, trying to isolate white's remaining weaknesses for a final offensive push. Creating a dangerous passed pawn on the kingside is an incredibly accurate counter-strike. White suddenly generates their own lethal threat, fully balancing the dynamic evaluation. Pushing the pawn accurately keeps the momentum going. Black maintains their slight initiative, engaging in a thrilling race of passed pawns on opposite sides of the board. Advancing the passed pawn to the penultimate rank accurately creates immediate panic. White executes the absolute best move, matching black's threats step for step. Continuing the pawn advance is solid and accurate. Black also pushes their passed pawn, ensuring the incredibly tense endgame remains perfectly balanced on a knife's edge. E7 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the king to c1, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the king to b2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e5 with highly aggressive threat. This allows the rook to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Placing the rook behind the passed pawn is a slight inaccuracy, surprisingly dropping a bit of evaluation. While conceptually logical to stop promotion, a direct promotion was faster and winning. Relocating the bishop is an accurate defensive try, exploiting black's inaccuracy. White desperately tries to cling to the game, temporarily reducing black's decisive advantage. Pushing the passed pawn to the penultimate rank accurately reinstates the massive threat. Black prepares for inevitable promotion, asserting their dominance once more. Moving the king closer to the action is solidly accurate. White optimally maneuvers to stop black's promotion, amazingly maintaining a drawn evaluation despite the terrifying visual threat. Improving the king's position accurately prepares for the final technical phase. Black solidifies their grip, navigating the complex endgame with solid strategic understanding. Activating the rook accurately is white's best defense. They prepare to sacrifice or monitor the key squares, holding on to a miraculous dynamic equality. Pushing the pawn with check is highly accurate, forcing white's king into a vulnerable position. Black brilliantly exploits tactical nuances to create maximum discomfort. Capturing the checking pawn with the king accurately eliminates a threat. White's precise defense continues to thwart black's attempts to convert their visual dominance into a win. Promoting to a queen is evaluated as a slight inaccuracy. While visually spectacular, it allows white a forced tactical sequence that completely equalizes the game to a dead draw. Sacrificing the rook for the new queen accurately liquidates the primary threat. White perfectly executes the drawing sequence, completely neutralizing black's previous advantage. Centralizing the king actively is a solid move. With material drastically reduced, black plays optimally in a position that is fundamentally drawn. Improving the king defensively is an accurate and necessary response. White easily maintains the draw by keeping their remaining structure solid and avoiding tactical traps. Advancing a pawn accurately seeks to create a weakness, but in a drawn endgame. Black continues to probe, forcing white to find the only defensive moves. Checking the king with the rook accurately forces the enemy monarch away. White utilizes the active piece perfectly to maintain the dynamic balance. Stepping the king forward accurately keeps up the pressure. Black refuses to concede the draw easily, playing the absolute best technical move in this simplified structure. Relocating the rook defensively is highly accurate. White prepares to blockade any pawn pushes and ensures their position remains impenetrable. Moving the king laterally is a solid technical attempt to outflank white. Black continues to press, fully utilizing their centralized king. The move, the rook to d1, with check by white, is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to c3, with check delivering a check that forces defensive coordination. Having the way for the king to d4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to 3 to organize the counter offensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the pawn to c3 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check where unlocking the king to a 1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to c2, guaranteeing long-term space control. Stepping the king to attack the rook is a slight inaccuracy, missing an even faster forced win. Nevertheless, black secures a crushing advantage, and the win is mere matter of technique. Retreating the rook is white's only solid option after the blunder. They attempt to rebuild the defensive fortress, but the structural damage and black's activity are too overwhelming. Pushing the f-pawn to create a dangerous passed pawn is completely winning. Black perfectly exploits the previous blunder, constructing an unstoppable threat. The move, the bishop to c5 by white, is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook takes on c4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board, paving the way for the pawn to f2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Next comes the rook to e4 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. whereby the king to f3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to b4 with highly aggressive threats. Next comes the pawn to a1, promoting to queen, with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. Capturing the crucial pawn accurately removes white's last dangerous counterplay. Black methodically simplifies into a vastly superior endgame, guaranteeing a comfortable technical win. Capturing a pawn with the rook is a solid attempt to resist, but the position is lost. White clears a pawn but cannot stop black's overwhelmingly superior coordination and passed pawn. Activating the rook to support the final assault is highly accurate. Black places their heavy piece optimally to enforce the promotion of their massive passed pawn. The move the rook to e4 with check by white is a mistake. The superior alternative was the bishop to b4, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Paving the way for the pawn to significantly boosting piece coordination. Next comes the rook to e4 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit, whereby the king to f3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to e8 with highly aggressive threat. This allows the pawn to f1, promoting to queen, guaranteeing long-term space control. And Shi, stepping the king away, accurately handles the check while staying highly active. Black demonstrates flawless endgame technique, easily sidestepping white's desperate flailing. The move, the bishop to d4 by white, is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to f4, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the rook to d1, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the king takes on b3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the pawn to a1 promoting to queen secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the rook takes on a1 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on a1, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Pushing the passed pawn to the penultimate rank is a crushing, decisive move. Black creates an unstoppable promotion threat, finalizing a spectacular display of positional dominance and endgame technique.